On today's video, we're taking a look at the top 10 books written about Dungeons & Dragons. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. The Top 10 series is an opportunity to take a closer look at some of the things we love about our hobby. And today, it's my favorite books written about the game of Dungeons & Dragons. Hope you enjoyed the video. This week, our channel hit a milestone. We reached 750 subscribers. So I wanted to do a special video and celebrate that with you all this weekend. I've been thinking about this video for a while, and I thought this is probably a good way to do that celebration. When it comes to Dungeons & Dragons, if you're anything like me, you sort of like everything about it. I like my old rule books, my player character sheets, my folders, my maps, my adventures, my magazines, my supplements. I like my dice and just everything that I have that's connected to that hobby. I love talking about Dungeons & Dragons, obviously. I love playing Dungeons & Dragons, and I love reading about Dungeons & Dragons. And so today we're going to take a look at my top 10 books about Dungeons & Dragons and more broadly, fantasy role-playing games. So let's take a look at exactly how I made my list. There's obviously a lot of books about the subject. I'm going to talk about both my top 10 list and sort of my honorable mention, which will be other books that I have that talk about it, just to share those with you. And I hope in the comments down below, if there are any books that you all know about that I didn't mention, please put them there, because I'm always looking for new things to read about Dungeons & Dragons. So, in order to qualify, I thought a book had to offer something new and interesting for the time. So a book written in 1980, might be new and interesting then. It might be something we all know really well now. But so it was interesting, relevant at the time it was written. The book had to inspire me to want to read or learn more. And it had to have a broad appeal, I would think, to anyone who enjoys Dungeons & Dragons would like this book, right? Whether you're a brand new player who's only been playing for a couple of years and only ever played maybe 5e, or you're an old grognard who's never done really much anything other than the original Dungeons & Dragons game. I think you would enjoy all the books on my list today. So let's take a look at the top 10 books about Dungeons & Dragons. There you go. Okay. Book number 10 is Of Dice and Men. Now, this book is written by David Ewalt. He also has some online videos you can watch about him talking about the book. And this one is really a book about his experience with Dungeons & Dragons as much as anything else. So it gives you a really good feel for nostalgia if you were playing back in that era. And I liked it quite a lot. This one I don't actually own. I think I got this one from the library. This was one of the first books I read about Dungeons & Dragons in recent years when I sort of got back into the hobby and wanted to find some things to read. Next, you may not recognize this. This is an old book. It's called Through Dungeons Deep. It is a fantasy gamer's handbook by a guy named Robert Plamondon. And it explains to you, sort of as someone who was coming to the hobby in the early era, he said, what is this? How does it work? How do you play this game? What's this Dungeons & Dragons thing's all about? It's written generically for fantasy games and even a little bit for other types of role-playing games, but really at its core, this is a guy who played Dungeons & Dragons, and it was written for these people who were curious about what it was and how you played this game. And it's everything from explanations for how you roll up a character, suggestions for new dungeon masters, and it's just really, really an interesting book and very, very well written. There's several books similar to this, and I'll mention a couple towards the end, but I think this book in particular is probably the best among those, in my opinion. Number 8, Empire of Imagination. This is a book by Michael Whitwer. And it's sort of the story of Gary and the creation of the game. It's obviously had some criticism, I think, that it was a little, maybe we'll say, one-sided, meaning it was, if you're into that debate, it was a little more Gary-friendly than Dave Arneson-friendly. But I thought it was very interesting. It was one of the first books I read where people were really digging into that and maybe taking a side is a fair way to say it, but telling that story. And it was a nice counterbalance then when I read some stuff from the guys from the Twin Cities and their sort of perspectives, and helped sort of round out, I thought, different views of what was happening back then. But still, good book. I really think you'd enjoy it. Number 7 on my list It's a little bit off center from the first few books. This is a book by a guy named Lawrence Schick. He worked for TSR, and he wrote this book called Heroic Worlds. It's a history and guide to all role-playing games. But first off, if you're a collector, buy a copy of this book. It can be a little expensive, and it can be a little bit hard to find. I got an old library book, right, where they recycled it out of the library. It doesn't really matter what condition it's in. The book itself and the content are what you want. It lists by genre and then by game, and it'll give you sort of have Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It lists all the rule books, the adventures, modules, accessories, anything you could buy. The name, a little blurb about it to help you understand what it is so you can decide whether you want to buy it. One of the things I love it for is it has all these third-party publishers, right? So all these third-party smaller companies that produce things for Dungeons and Dragons or other games, but I'm looking for Dungeons and Dragons. He talks about those things in there, a little background on the company, and like I said, a little blurb about the different things you might want to buy. So it's great for helping you build a list of things you might want to collect. If you skew in a particular direction for what kind of things you like, it helps you figure out if those things are the kind of things you might want to collect. Great book. I highly recommend it to anybody who's a collector. It gives you a little bit of information around the edges, sort of in terms of history, but mostly for anyone who's into Dungeons and Dragons like I am and who wants to have a good collection. I think it's an invaluable book. Something a little more modern. I think everybody probably recognizes this and certainly recognizes this author. This is John Peterson's Game Wizard. And remember I talked about that different points of view between Gary and Dave. Well, this is John Peterson's researched book about those early days. He talks about the back and forth struggle between Dave and Gary, which included some of the litigation over who had the rights to the game, well, in particular had the IP and the royalty rights when the game was changed from D&D to AD&D, etc. And just gives you a lot of really well-researched, and I think John's a great writer, so well-written information about that story. If you don't know anything about that, if you're interested in the early days and sort of that part of it, this is your book. Very well written, very easy to read. I think it was maybe a week, and that's a short period of time for me because I don't sit and read for long periods of time, generally with everything else I got going on in life. But this book is fantastic, and you're going to love it. Number 5 on my list. Now we reach way back. This is Dr. Eric Holmes. He is the person who did the writing or editing for the Holmes box set. That is the one that's the Dave Sutherland drawing or painting on the front. This is a dragon. It's sort of a blue rulebook cover, and it's the first time when we had OD&D before the Moldvay edition, and they tried to write a basic consolidated rules for first to third level to help new gamers who weren't war gamers get introduced to the hobby. Right, Dr. Holmes did that. Well, they came out with this book called Fantasy Role-Playing Games. It's an overview. It's a discussion. I think he's a good writer. I think it's a very good book. It's very insightful, and it's from someone who was right there at sort of ground zero with the hobby and the development of the hobby in the very early days. This is a pretty hard book to find. It's fairly old. Wasn't, as you might imagine, produced in huge numbers, oftentimes libraries. So you're doing some hunting to find this. If you find it, snag a copy for yourself. Do yourself a favor. It's a good read. Okay, book number 4, A Familiar Face. Familiar name, I guess, more properly said. This is John Peterson. He's written a few books. This is The Elusive Shift. It's probably my favorite book of his. This one's a little, I'll say, denser than the Game Wizard's book. It talks about role-playing games and how we went from sort of wargaming to this concept that it was role-playing. And this one involves an awful lot of research that he did through the reading of fanzines, especially Alarms and Excursions on the West Coast and the Wild Hunt on the East Coast, and a number of other early, there's fanzines which were amateur gamer produced articles. And one of the things that he points out that's really interesting is just the way all those people who were writing extensively month after month, remember, and interacting with each other, if not in person, then at least through their fanzine production, talking about issues like the magic system and role-playing, and was it basically the DM's job to challenge the players and let them die? Was it the DM's job to create a fun story? Has everybody had a good time? These tensions and debates that we're having today, which tend to take the form of, first edition or early D&D versus 5e, right? It feels very generational now, and so we got a lot of stuff layered into that, which you didn't have in the early days. But the debate on the topics were there already, and every bit as animated. But there just wasn't anything else layered on top of it. It was just really just a debate about how to play D&D, and people felt very strongly about it. And it's very well researched. And you guys who watch my channel know I love fanzines. I've got now 100 videos talking about fanzines, and so for me, this was really right in the thing I love the most in terms of topic and material. So I like this a lot. You may not love it as much as I did. It's probably deserves to be in the top 10 for the average person who doesn't love fanzines as much as I do. This one may fall down towards the bottom of the list. Again, I love everything John does. Great contributor to our hobby and our understanding of the history, etc. So for me, it's right up here at the top. Okay. Number 3, Designers and Dragons, Shannon Appelcline. Of everybody on this list, Shannon's probably my favorite author in terms of the ease with which I think you can digest what he says. He's just a really easy author to read. This is a broader history. If you don't have it, first off, stop the video, go buy a copy. I think you can probably still find it on Amazon. There's an old version, just so you know what you're looking at. I think it's black, maybe even leatherette. He now has 4 books, right? And that had all the books in it. Then he expands it. Now there's 4 different books, one for each decade. This is the 70s to 79. There's 80 to 89, 90 to 99, 2000, 2009, I guess, or 10. And the way he writes this, he talks about the companies that got started in that decade, right? So this is obviously the one that has TSR in it, along with most of the companies that you're familiar with if you're sort of, plugged into the early era, right? People, you have things like Mayfair Games, I'm pretty sure is in there. The folks over that did, RuneQuest at Chaosium Games are in there. Tunnels and Trolls is in here. And again, as you might imagine, the TSR section is huge. And so he talks about the company, he gives you some history, he talks about the products, and it's just very, very well done. And I think just in terms of, this sort of history, Shannon is a fantastic member of the community, and there's all kinds of ways, you can connect with Shannon and see what he's working on now. He's working on, I think, like 3 or 4 different books at the same time right now. Some of that I'm really excited about because it's looking back at some other companies from the early era, and he's adding on to his original work. And so Shannon's got a lot going on, and if you don't know him, please, if nothing else, this video should introduce you to Shannon Appelcline because he's fantastic. Okay, number 2 book on my list is going to be John Peterson again. This is his most famous work. This is Playing at the World, and the original book is a great big thick book, and if you haven't been paying attention, he just came out with the first of a 2-part series of what he's calling very playfully 2E. So it's a revised edition of Playing at the World. It's reorganized, new material as well. I just got this book and finished reading it as well very recently. It's great. It's nuts and bolts history of role-playing, history of D&D, TSR, and all that. And so if you really like this stuff and you want to read several hundred pages about it, here's your book. I think, I got both. The first book's pretty hard to find because it's out of print now. And so you're not, don't have anything to worry about if you're just going to end up getting the second edition. The second book is coming out, I think, pretty soon, I think later this year. But if you have both, I don't think you'll be sorry about that either. They're formatted a little differently and some of the writing's a little bit different. But fantastic books if you really, like as he said somewhere on a blog I saw sometime, it's a lot of detail, it's a lot of information, but for me, can't ever get enough of that. So I love John Peterson, and I love this book of his as well. Okay, number 1 for me, not sure if you know what this is or not. For me, the number 1 book is going to be Art and Arcana. John Peterson, by the way, is connected to this book as well. But this book was more I think, a product about the game, really celebrating the game. It has fantastic art in there. I would sit and read it on the weekends with my coffee, on a Saturday morning, Sunday morning, for an hour or two before anybody else in the family got up. And somehow I stumbled across this book during COVID, early COVID, and just started reading it, and it really sparked me to get back into playing Dungeons and Dragons. I hadn't played for a real long time. I'm like, I always loved this game. And so there's that emotional component why this ends up probably number one for me, because to me, the book was so good. It reminded me everything I loved about the game, between the images and the stories and new information that was in there that I didn't know. So it inspired me to get back into playing Dungeons and Dragons. It inspired me to get back into actually sort of, I guess you say, studying or reading about Dungeons and Dragons, all because I didn't know the stories about, the controversy between Dave and Gary. I didn't know anything about that when I was a kid, when I was playing, right? So because of that, for me, this was sort of the genesis of the fanzine collections that I've got now and the videos that I do, all sort of sparked out of this book, and it's fantastic. There's a collector's edition here with the gold foil on it. You don't need that. The insides are just as good, although this does come with a slip cover and a little bit of extra information about the very early convention version of Tomb of Horrors. So it's got a couple little extras in there that you might want, but just get the regular book. It's not very expensive at all because it was mass produced, and you should have it on your shelf. You'll enjoy it. It's an oversized book. Like I said, the artwork, it's a beautiful book, and for me, it's number one. So that's my countdown. Let's talk about some books that didn't make the cut. I think this is pretty much every book in my collection that I have, or at least that I could find. This is a pretty recent book. It's called 50 Years of Dungeons and Dragons. It has a number of separate essays in it. It has one by John Peterson, Zach Howard, Arch Xenopus, who's the big Holmes D&D guy out there in our hobby who's always focused on that, had an article. That's actually how I knew about it. That's why I got it. Has a number of essays, a lot from academia, not all of them, but most of them. So some folks are going to enjoy reading that kind of stuff, but it's very professor approach to articles about the game and how to look at the game from sort of more of an academician's point of view. So, some people are going to like that. It's a change of pace for me. My brother's a professor. He told me I should take my notes from what I liked and didn't like and send them back to these professors. He said they'd like it. I don't know if that's true. Someday I might do that. Okay. Appendix N, buy it. This is a book about the books or the authors that are mentioned in Appendix N. He's got short stories in here for you to read by several of those authors. This was a great book. I liked reading it, and it inspired me to go to the local bookstore and find more books by the authors on that list, and I've been really glad to do that. So it's definitely, and there's a new version of this, by the way, I think, if I just recently heard that. So go get the new version. Here's an old book, Martin Hackett, Fantasy Wargaming. I think there's actually 3 different printings, and because I collect too much stuff, I've got all 3 of those. This is a really interesting book from that period, telling you what is fantasy wargaming, how does that work. He explains how to have combat with miniatures and stuff like that, as well as talking about really fantasy role-playing games as well. This is a great book I've mentioned in my one or two of my videos about Judges Guild. This is written by Bill Owen. And it's a memory of his about his time working with Bob Bledsoe when they started Judges Guild and got that company up and running. And so if you don't know about Judges Guild, look into that. I've got some videos on it. It's a great company, great early products, and this is a really easy read, pretty thin book, but a great read. 40 Years of Gen Con by Robin Laws. He's, again, another person that I really like to read his material. I think he's a good thinker about role-playing games and stuff like that. This is a reflection on 40 years of Gen Con. I've never been. It'd probably be more sentimental to me if I had. I always wanted to go as a kid. That was like Mecca for me, right? I'm going to go to Gen Con someday. And now it's turned into this, I don't know, small city descends on Indianapolis Convention Center, I think, to do this every year. But in any event, really nice book. It's really well done. My brother got me this one year for Christmas, Rise of the Dungeon Master, and it's more of a graphic novel, but still, so not as much meat there, but still fun to read. Slaying the Dragon, recent book by Ben Riggs, And the reason probably this one ends up on my sort of honorable mention pile instead of my top 10 was a lot of what's in here is stuff I already knew. And he's got just he's got a sliver. So, and probably was overhyped that he's got this great like new information. There's a sliver of new information in there where he talks about some of the financial things that were going on, and I found that really, really interesting. But it was sort of like, well, there's this whole book. 90% of this is stuff I've picked up in all these other books I've already read because I read them before I got to Ben's. And there's just a small amount of stuff that's new, which is, again, well written. And if you haven't read all these other books, and this is a place to start, it's pretty interesting. And I really did enjoy the extra information he'd picked up because, I work on corporate deals a lot in, my other life as a professional. And so the business side of that and the negotiations and all that kind of stuff I thought was really interesting. So good book. This one feels a little non sequitur to me, but the Art of Dragon magazine's on my shelf. I like it. It's sort of about it's sort of about Dungeons and Dragons, maybe just mostly about the art. But I love the art. I love all the art that has to do with our game. And so anyway, I tossed this in there. If it's a book you don't have, you should, I think you should get it. Here's a small press book by a friend of mine that I've played online with. His name's Stephen Wendell. Great guy. He wrote this book. It's real small, but it's really, really good. It's a heartfelt sort of memoir about how he came to learn about Dungeons and Dragons and the early games of Dungeons and Dragons. And so it'll take you an afternoon, an hour or two maybe to read it. But I recommend it. Get it for your collection. Here's an older one. This is Ian Livingston, who you may know from Games Workshop fame. He was one of the co-founders with Steve Jackson. And this is called Dicing with Dragons. There's a couple different versions of this. And it's just an introduction to role-playing games. And it's really good, really well written as well. And I think, if I remember correctly, it even has a like a choose-your-own-adventure concept of a dungeon stuck in there so you could sort of play through and get a sense of what that was like by yourself. Kent David Kelly has written a series of books called Hawk and Moor, Gray Hawk and Black Moor. I didn't know that when I bought the book, but he tells you, fortunately, in there where the name came from. This is only volume 1. There's 4 or 5 of these, at least, I think, that he's done. These are sort of aggregations of historical information that he's gotten off of blogs and obviously research and interviews and magazine interviews, things Gary or other people wrote in Dragon or other things through the years, and he sort of tries to pull it all together and put it into a history. I thought it was pretty good. Like I said, I've only got have and read the first one, but I'm going to get the other ones and read as time allows. The Fantasy Role-Playing Gamer's Bible. It's not a necessary part of every person's collection, but if you can grab a copy, shouldn't be too expensive. And it just gives you an overview of role-playing games and talks about a number of different types of role-playing games. There's a nice book with a lot of great art and it's very slick production called 30 Years of Adventure. And it's sort of a visual, there's text in it too, but a visual celebration of D&D. It's a pretty good book. And, again, you're a collector. It's the kind of thing you want up on your shelf. I looked through it when I got it, looked through it a couple times since then. I don't really think I learned anything from it, right? That's probably why it's down here in the honorable mention. And then there's this brand new mega book, right, that just came out, and I got a copy of that. It's called The Making of Original Dungeons & Dragons. It's $100. It's a little on the expensive side. If you can pick up a copy for less, maybe do that. Here's the 2 things I liked about it. There's sections in there. So some of it's like reprinting the original Dungeons & Dragons rules. If you don't have that, it's a pretty cheap way to get it, because if you wanted to buy those, the actual old versions of those books, right, they're way more than $100. So you get those, but the cool thing, and they knew this, is they've got the original or a very early manuscript of D&D, typed up on Gary's typewriter. So it's interesting to see that that text. And if you're really into this stuff, it's interesting to see that text and be able to read through the original version compared to what gets published and, of course, where it's evolved. They also have a couple reprints of the Strategic Review, which are pretty hard to find, and some other excerpts from some of the early books like the Greyhawk Supplement and Blackmore Supplement, etc. So it's a very slick production. It's a beautiful book. It's huge. I don't think you need to read it, but if you really would be interested in that, a copy of the early version of the D&D rules, I think that's why people would buy it. That's why I bought it, because I wanted to read those. So a couple other books that I forgot I had and noticed after I finished the video, we're going to stick this in here. The first one is The Complete Guide to Role-Playing Games by Rick Swan. The first section covers what role-playing games are, and then 90+% of this book are reviews of all different role-playing games. So he might say, the game's called AD&D. Here are the books you need to buy. Here are some of the good supplements about it. Some of the reviews are longer or shorter. He gives you like a star rating, tells you whether the rules are sort of good for beginners, moderate, or complex in terms of like how hard it is to learn either the rules or how the game works. So it's a pretty good overview of that to give you an idea of what games you might want to buy. And this other one is What is Dungeons and Dragons by John Butterfield and others. There's probably 3 different covers to this same book. Very much a product of the era back in the 80s. It's a bit of, I guess I'd call it an apologist book. It's trying to explain what the game is to people who don't know, and also to dispel some of the misconceptions and crazy rumors that were out there about what the game was. So he explains, what is this game? How does it work? Tries to dispel the myth, the mystery around it, and encourage everyone. Like you should play this game. It's a lot of fun. It's good for creativity. It's just, you just have a good time playing D&D. This is not particularly expensive. So this, if you like reading that sort of period of the time book, if you think that the kind of thing is a fun thing to read for a couple of days, this is a good book for you. And so again, there's 2 more books from my collection. And now I think that's just about everything I have. What'd y'all think? How did my list compare to yours? And most importantly, do me a favor and tell me what books you love that I didn't even talk about, because that means I don't know about them and I'd like to read them probably. So make sure you put those down in the comments below so I can add to my reading list, because I'm pretty well through most of the books about Dungeons and Dragons that I have here already. Thanks for being part of the community. Thanks for helping me get to 750 subscribers, and I think we're well on our way to going to and over 1,000 here sometime around the end of the year. Hope you guys have a great weekend. Play some role-playing games with your friends, and until next time, keep rolling 20s.